Frances Haugen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Listen, I want to begin in 2019 because it was in that year that you were named the lead on the civic misinformation team at Facebook. And essentially it worked on misinformation and democracy. And I'm kind of wondering, because it was a few years back already, what were you already seeing back then?
So it was interesting. I thought I was coming in to work on misinformation in, say, the United States or in Canada. But I showed up and in fact, I got put on misinformation anywhere Facebook lacked third-party fact checkers. So third-party fact checkers are the people who try to find individual stories and say, is this true or not? And what shocked me was the reality is for most users in the world, Facebook had no fact checking. And then they didn't just not have fact checking. For the vast majority of languages in the world, there are no safety systems. So Facebook only supported a few languages like English and French.
So you have this vast territory then. So how did you and your team go about identifying examples of misinformation, disinformation, and how did you deal with it?
So because we could not rely on fact checkers, we had to think more holistically about how to approach mis and disinformation. So if you can't look at individual stories, you have to ask questions like, why is the system as a whole promoting extreme content more than other content? And so our team initially focused on things like, can we identify when a place is surging with misinformation? Because Facebook had the tools to turn down the volume, turn down the heat, but they would only deploy them once there was active violence on the ground.
Okay, well, that leads me to my next question then, because of course things change. Famously, you become the Facebook whistleblower, something that you acknowledge yourself in your book of last year. What was the turning point for you? Where did you reach that you said to yourself, I can no longer work for Facebook?
Well, I think it's different than a question of I can no longer work for Facebook, because if I could, I would go back and work there today. Like, Facebook is so important. It is the internet for some of the most vulnerable people in the world in places like African countries, Southeast Asia. But the question of, should I come forward? Is there information the public desperately needs? Am I willing to be a whistleblower? That happened when Facebook dissolved the civic integrity team. So the part of Facebook that was responsible for making sure Facebook was a positive force in the world. They dissolved it right after the 2020 election. And it was at that point that it became clear to me that Facebook couldn't course correct on its own, that it would need help from the public if it was going to be able to heal itself.
Okay, need help from the public. Do you think governments, public entities can actually do anything to counter misinformation, disinformation as it exists on social media?
So like I mentioned before, there's lots and lots of tools available. So imagine something as simple as, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it? Should you have to actually see the thing that you're going to share? That sounds like a really small change, but it leads to 10 or 15% less misinformation. There's a bunch of these changes like this that are not very complicated, that don't involve checking individual pieces of content. But the reason why they're not used today is the incentives are to maximize profit over maximizing public safety. So the thing the government can do is things like the Canadian Online Harms Bill. You can come there and shift the incentives. So suddenly when a platform has a change, I'll give you an example. There was a single change that would reduce misinformation on the platform by 35%. But it would also decrease usage of the platform by like 1%. Is 1% less profit worth 35% less misinformation? In a world where we don't get to see behind the curtain, like we don't get to see what the trade-offs were, Facebook demonstrated time and time again they would choose that profit over public safety.
As you're speaking, I also think, of course, the world has also changed with the advent of AI. And, that was not something you were dealing with in 2019 with Facebook. How does that complicate the picture when it comes to disinformation?
When we look at how we can address those problems, AI scales those systems in ways that we've never seen before. So it used to be you had to trade off between how many people do I want to pay for, like how many staff do I want to run my information campaign, versus how many times do I want to repeat what I'm saying. So you can have a few people who, if they repeat the same thing over and over again, they can run an influence operation. It used to be the way we'd catch these systems is by looking at that repetition. When you introduce AI, now every single piece of misinformation can be slightly different. There is no repetition. And we've already seen examples of technology being used in this way.
So given this extra layer then, when you consider the social responsibility that social media companies bear, Meta, X, others, what do you think they need to be doing in order to counter misinformation, disinformation?
Facebook every quarter posts how many fake accounts they take down. You would think with the rise of AI in the last year, the number of fake accounts they took down would go up dramatically. When you actually look at the stats, though, it dropped off a cliff. We don't know exactly why that is, but Facebook bragged last year about their year of efficiency. They went in and fired thousands of people who worked on trust and safety. My favorite researchers are all now outside the company and not voluntarily. The most important obligation for these social media companies is to adequately invest in teams to go and find the patterns of these fake accounts. Meta, TikTok, and X, they could all be taking down dramatically more fake accounts. And those are the ones that actually spread the misinformation. But they only can do that if they're willing to pay for the staffing to do so. Effective online accountability laws help shift those incentives. Every person who searches for a fake account costs money. They don't bring in more profit, or at least they don't in the short term. Having a system that's not pleasant because there's too many fake accounts does decrease long-term profitability. So we want laws that help shift those incentives so they make the right decisions each day. Okay,
shift the incentive. Does that need to be legislated, though? Because I wonder, because you have met so many political leaders, not only in Canada and the United States, but around the world. What advice do you give them about the power of legislation?
Well, what I always frame for legislators is, we're beyond the point where nothing is going to happen. It used to be there were kind of three options. Do you just keep the status quo, do nothing? Do you pass something practical, moderate, or do you pass something more extreme? What I always say is, for every social issue, there's a finite number of children we're willing to harm. And when we cross that line, often action is dramatic. What I always frame to people is, the choice now is not, do we act or not act? It's, do we act sooner with something practical and moderate, intentional? Or do we wait for the metaphorical wrong child to die and pass something emotional and extreme? We're already seeing little glimmers of this in the United States, where different states are passing radically different online harms bills. Do we want to have something extreme go through that maybe violates children's privacy? Or do we want to think about something intentional and practical and do it today?
You say we're beyond the point of doing nothing. So does that mean you're hopeful that we as a society have the tools to actually counter this?
I believe the European Union and the UK have demonstrated nations can act. Communities of nations can act. One of the things that I hope Canadians know is that the Canadian Online Harm Bill was created in a very different way than any other major piece of online regulation has in the last few years. They did lots of public assemblies. So they went and had representative groups of Canadians argue about the conflicts inherent in these issues and come to compromises. What is something we can agree to? And the Online Harm Bill, I'm so optimistic about it because it's tighter, it's more efficient than, say, what the European Union did. And I'm extremely excited about not just Canada passing it, but bringing it as model legislation to places like Australia or Brazil, which are also hungry for action, but might not have the access to resources that Canada does.